I think an interesting example of one of Google's blind spots, which is that they thought, okay, well, how are we going to monetize Gmail? They said, easy, ads. We'll put ads in Gmail. You know, you're planning a hike and it'll give you an ad for hiking boots right there. And then they launch it and people are like, this is super creepy. And they're kind of like, what? I'm just like, guys, how could you not have seen that coming? Hey there, welcome to Book Overflow. This is the podcast for software engineers by software engineers, where every week we read one of the best technical books in the world in an effort to improve our craft. I am Carter Morgan, and I'm joined here, as always, by my co-host, Nathan Toups. How are you doing, Nathan? Well, thanks for listening, everyone. As always, like, comment, subscribe wherever you're at. Share the podcast with your friends and coworkers. Share it on LinkedIn. You can tag us on LinkedIn if you want. We always get a kick out of people tagging us on LinkedIn. And stay tuned. I know we've had some people ask us about author interviews. We have not forgotten that exists in the podcast. We just put a bit of a pause on it while I wrapped up my master's degree, and we have some exciting stuff working through the pipeline. So we don't count our chickens before they hatch here at Book Overflow, but we are optimistic about bringing some really cool content to you guys here in the future. So stay tuned. And in the meantime, we still got our standard content, which I also think is pretty cool. And we're excited to keep talking about it. That we are doing In The Plex this week, covering the second chunk of the book. It's parts 3 through 5. This is also really embarrassing. We realized this after the podcast when we recorded. We had agreed last week to read parts 1 and 2, and each part is divided into chapters. I only read chapters 1 and 2 last week, and somehow just didn't notice it. So if you listened to the episode last week and were like, wow, they're really focused on like the early stuff. Like, yeah, that's because that's all I read. And we didn't even realize. Yeah, Nathan did the right thing.
I definitely remember you like kind of sided me a couple times because you're like, why is this guy going on about this stuff that I'm thinking like it's in the material. But if I'd only read chapter 1 and 2, I think I would have been like, man,
yeah,
he's going out there.
Yeah.
But the thing is, the book goes out there. This book is fascinating. And I guess we can get into the author introduction and stuff maybe first.
Yeah, let's do that. But I think this episode will probably mark about the 1-year anniversary of Book Overflow from we first went public.
I was just thinking about I knew we were getting close to it last night when I was thinking like we're getting the outline ready for this episode. But yeah, wow.
Yeah, because we launched in June of last year, and we are recording. What is it? I think it's June 6th today. Anyhow, so let's be proud that within 1 year of doing Book Overflow, that's the first time that happened. But let's talk about In The Plex. And like, honestly, it doesn't surprise me that we were able to still record a great episode despite only having read 40% of what I should have, because there is so much stuff in this book. I know. I listened to about 10 hours of it this week. Let's talk about first the author of In The Plex. We got Steven Levy here. Steven Levy is one of technology journalism's most respected voices, having chronicled the digital revolution for over 3 decades as a senior writer for Newsweek and later Wired magazine. Known for his unprecedented access to text inner circles and his ability to translate complex technical concepts into compelling narratives, Levy previously authored the seminal book Hackers, Heroes of the Computer Revolution, and has covered Google since its earliest days in 1999, making him uniquely qualified to tell the company's inside story. And that's what this is. The book introduction we have, In The Plex, offers an unprecedented inside look at Google from its origins as a Stanford research project through its evolution into one of the world's most powerful companies, based on Levy's experience or extensive access to the company's founders, employees, and internal meetings over several years. The book reveals how Larry Page and Sergey Brin's breakthrough PageRank algorithm revolutionized internet search, how Google's unique culture and data-driven approach to innovation shaped products that billions use daily, and how the company's meteoric rise created new challenges around privacy, corporate power, and the very nature of human knowledge in the digital age. So yeah, so much stuff in this book. And just like, the book bills itself, very unique, very extensive access to Google, and lots of really cool insights that kind of detail how Google was made. This week we did parts 3 through 5, which there's like a bajillion things in those parts. I'm just trying to maybe give a high level overview of what we've got here. We've got, so I guess part 3, we can just read the culture, the titles. Don't Be Evil, How Google Built Its Culture. Part 4, Google's Cloud, Building Data Centers That Hold Everything Ever Written. And we have part 5, Outside the Box, the Google Phone Company and the Google TV Company. So that deals with Android, YouTube, Google TV, a lot of the different products that Google's built. And then even more products, like we have the data centers, Gmail, like a bajillion things in this book. Nathan, how do you feel about parts 3 through 5 of In The Plex?
Yeah, this gave me a much deeper appreciation, and I think it's similar to my sentiments. I'm both fascinated and horrified by many aspects of Google. And what's funny is that like this book really shows you what a force of nature their way of thinking is, right? Even if I maybe don't necessarily agree, or I'm a little more nervous about some of the philosophical implications of, what unchecked power at this pace can lead to us. And it's not even necessarily a Google problem. I think we're seeing the same thing with OpenAI. We're seeing the same thing with any industry that's like, most people can't wrap their heads around where leadership sees the company going in 5 years. And even though some of their ideas are so radical in today's context, they're not radical at all to the founders. And I think that is a rinse and repeat argument. I think that, this book, this is really interesting. I loved the culture section, even though like you kind of have to have this culture section to understand what parts 4 and 5 get into. But their insatiable sort of hunger for talent that was it cut from the same cloth that Larry and Sergey are from, is both elitist and like absolutely fascinating, because they definitely missed out on different groups of talent, but they also gave a voice to a type of free thinker who is product oriented and also incredible engineering skills kind of wrapped up into one, as like one big chaotic company. I always knew kind of aspects of this, but I didn't know the depth of it. I really didn't appreciate how absolutely like insane and just earth-shatteringly, radical some of these like perspectives were. So, yeah.
Yeah.
It's a lot. There's a lot. There's a lot in this book, though.
I mean, we're living in Google's world these days, right? And you kind of, it's a little like, the fish doesn't know what water is because he swims in it every day. I wrote here, I think Larry and Sergey would drive me nuts. And I think that's true.
I think they drove a lot of people nuts. I mean, you see this through the book too.
It's something I've wondered about a lot. Like, again, a figure I admire is maybe too strong a word because I have complicated feelings about him, is Jeff Bezos. Just in the sense that, like, maybe I find him impressive is probably the better way to phrase that. But I find it impressive, his drive, his ambition, what he built. I'm just like, I never want to work for this guy. I don't even want to meet this guy because he seems like a maniac. And that's kind of how I feel about like Larry and Sergey. I'm just like, we'll talk just a bit about kind of like maybe some of how they worked, but yeah, insane stuff. And
I would love to meet all three of them. I don't know if they would be interested in me, right? Like it'd be like, it's one of these things where there's this sort of like brutal clarity in their thinking that I can appreciate, but I'm also like, I feel like I could hang on certain subject matters, but I probably couldn't in most others, right? And it's very interesting to see how this world is uniquely positioned for the Larry Pages and the Sergey Brins and the Jeff Bezos and the Elon Musks of the world.
Oh, yeah.
50 years ago or 100 years ago, it wouldn't have been that way, right?
Yeah. Well, I wonder, right? It's something I think about a lot. I think two of the greatest TV comedies of all time are 30 Rock and Community. And we talk about TV too much on this podcast. But one thing I know is that like their writer rooms were brutal. Like from everything I've read about it, like just very, very difficult environments to work in, very workaholic, big messes. And it's just like, and it produced like some of the greatest TV of all time. And so it's just like, I don't know. So I think about that sometimes. Like, is that what it takes to make something great? Do you just have to work for a maniac or be a maniac. This is an interesting book. Here's all I'll say. This is a very interesting book to read after having read Rework, because
Yes.
Rework says kind of the exact opposite.
Right. I would honestly, I'd rather live in a rework world.
Oh, totally.
Again, I appreciate that there's these forces of nature, but I do think that there's a way that you can move too fast where the unintended consequences of what you create, it's sort of like Pandora's box. Like once you open the box, you can't put the stuff back in.
Yeah.
And while some of them are amazing innovations, some of them I think really could have side effects that can go sideways. And so yeah, so to tie into I loved the way that part 3 starts. So part 3 goes straight into this quote from Marissa Mayer about them being Larry and Sergey being Montessori kids.
Yeah.
I guess I could bring up the quote. I think it's actually even on the back cover of the book. So let me pull this up.
I want to know what the back cover looks like.
You can't understand. Yeah, you can't understand Google unless you know that both Larry and Sergey are Montessori kids. And it basically says that like their whole upbringing was to question everything, and that you basically these, and I think it's a bit reductive. There's a lot of kids who go through Montessori and are not Sergey and Larry. So, but I do think this idea that like, and we see this time and time again in the book, people come up to them and tell them, oh, the thing you want to do is impossible. And they go, I don't think so. I think you're wrong. And then they try to verify, like substantiate it with some data, and then they're correct. And they, time and time again, Larry or Sergey will basically like do a calculation and show that something is maybe 2 or 3 orders of magnitude, in Google's advantage, and people can't wrap their heads around it, right?
Yeah.
I think, well, I'm skipping ahead a little bit, but they were talking about like the valuation of YouTube when they decided to buy it, and they end up offering $1 billion more. There was $1 billion more in the valuation than it was like a couple of months before, right?
Yeah. I think Eric Schmidt, he later said in like a deposition, like it was worth 600 million at the time, would be my guess, but they pay 1.6 billion for it.
Right. And so like, and then they kind of talk about the crazy math that goes into that, and they're like, oh, we're pricing in the future value and growth and all these other things, but they end up being that's an incredible deal, right?
Yeah,
1.6 billion for their acquisition. YouTube is now, I think within certain generation demographics, is like the #1 search engine.
Interesting.
They go to YouTube first over anything. These numbers may have shifted now that we have large language models. But there's definitely a type of search that I do. Like if I'm doing a do-it-yourself home repair.
Oh yeah,
Of course I'm going to go to YouTube first, right? Like of course I'm going to do that. And it was kind of cool because they recognized that they had been trying to make Google Video, and they just couldn't get user adoption. They couldn't get the partnerships, and they realized that these, couple of young guys who had built YouTube were just running circles around them as far as like the cool factor, the growth factor, being a little edgy in the fact that they weren't policing copyright like they were supposed to. That actually led to user adoption.
Just a quick note on Montessori, in case I know not everyone that listens to the podcast is familiar with childhood educational approaches. This is Google's AI overview. It says Montessori education is a child-centered educational approach developed by Dr. Maria Montessori, emphasizing hands-on learning, independence, and self-directed learning environment. It's a holistic method that focuses on the development of the whole child, physical, social, emotional, and cognitive. So, Montessori schools are very like, you let the child work on or play with whatever they're interested in. And, it can be, I have some friends who have done Montessori stuff. And from what I've observed, especially if you have a very high achieving or bright child, it can be really a great fit for them. And so you can imagine how Larry and Sergey, who are obviously very, very bright, would have done that. But it leads to them, being like these kind of, question everything people. And in my opinion, I think makes them, I don't know, like, I think that there is value in social graces, and I think Larry, and I can't remember which one, I think Larry in particular has a little bit of trouble with that. And we'll just kind of like in the middle of meetings, if someone's presenting something, and be like, this is the stupidest crap, I've ever seen. Why on earth are we working on this? Shut it down. I'm just like, oh, I don't know. Maybe be a little nicer than that.
And they kind of gloss over this. I mean, they mention it a little bit towards the end of part 5, but this book is very rose-colored lenses about Google, even when they talk about
it's true
some of the other stuff. Because for instance, I was doing Apple IT consulting before I got into cloud computing, and so I actually witnessed. I started my own business when the iPad came out. And they kind of go through the story here where there's this deep betrayal of Steve Jobs, at least how he perceived it, right? He kind of mentored these guys as they kind of became the next sort of like blessed group out of Silicon Valley.
Apple and Google had a very good relationship because they saw themselves as completely complementary. Apple was focused on building beautiful hardware. Exactly, right. And I remember the first iPhone came out with it didn't have an app store, but so it just had the apps pre-installed in it, and 2 of those were Google Maps and YouTube. And so when Google invents Android, like you said, Nathan, I mean, Steve Jobs used this as a very deep betrayal of their trust.
Right. And what's funny is even to this day, and I'm surprised that Apple hasn't gotten into it, but Apple still hasn't gotten into search, right? Apple's not a search company. It's funny, it's a little side note. I could have sworn for years that DuckDuckGo was going to be an acquisition target by Apple. Just because DuckDuckGo had also integrated Apple Maps, like DuckDuckGo isn't used, and they're very privacy oriented, and that's like one thing for Apple. I mean, who knows? Maybe it'll happen one day, and this will be hilarious because I'm like, I don't know why this didn't happen, but maybe Apple. But I remember when I was an IT consultant, though, I was like, I would even say this to customers. I was like, Apple doesn't understand the internet. Like they don't get it. Because I was like a big fan of Google. I was doing G Suite setups early, like for small businesses that wanted to run G Suite because it was way cheaper than Office. It wasn't Office 365 at the time, but it was like all of Microsoft's like Exchange server stuff. And I was big on like moving to Dropbox and a bunch of other like cloud oriented stuff with Apple devices. That's basically like what my consulting business was early on. And so we had to bridge this like radical new world of these kind of cloud first solutions with these beautifully built mobile devices. And Android was fine too. Like it was more niche at the time. Android's very mainstream now, but back in the early 2010s, it was kind of like the geek platform who wanted to do more googly stuff, right? But it's true that Google is a force of nature, and I think my perspective of witnessing this as it went was really funny. Like I think there was one section they were talking about where like we were talking about developing Chrome. Oh, and this is one of the things that came up too, right? Is that they were developing Chrome web browser. This was another betrayal. And again, Chrome originally was based off of the core WebKit that was where Safari came from. So Safari had an open source core called WebKit, and Chrome originally forked that and then created the Chrome browser. And they made a tremendous number of improvements, like added V8 and all these other kind of cool things that we'll talk about now. But they really started doing stuff that made Steve Jobs furious to the point where like by his death, he was like, oh, these are my mortal enemies. Basically.
Steve Jobs, another man I find impressive and never want to meet.
Right?
Exactly.
Impressive
right.
And terrifying.
Chrome. So much stuff we could talk about here. Chrome, I thought was really interesting because, they create their JavaScript engine V8, and I think they said it was running JavaScript like 56 times faster than the Internet Explorer.
Yeah, their 10x, goal was 10x. Yeah.
But I really appreciate this about Google, and you have maybe this latitude when you're operating at the scale Google is, and I know I've seen people talk about online kind of like people talk like, oh, Google's fascinating culture that did this or that, and it's all about their culture that created this. And there's truth to that. It's also really easy to have a culture of kind of like open-mindedness and learning when your primary product, AdWords, like is a money geyser. Like they just had so much money coming in that they could afford to kind of do crazy stuff. And Chrome was kind of one of those crazy things where it's like, what are we going to get out of a browser? And the engineers at Google were very worried because Google had been a very strong supporter of the Mozilla Foundation and Firefox up until that point, which prided itself on being open source. And so the Google engineers were kind of like, we're going to create our own browser that's going to compete with Firefox. And so that was a compromise Google made. They said, well, our browser will also be open source. But so if your browser is going to be open source, like, why even create a browser? And it really went down to two reasons. One is kind of conventional. The second I thought was far more interesting. The first one was they didn't want to be beholden to the people who make browsers like Microsoft. They kind of figured it's possible that Microsoft will create their own search engine one day, which they did. And they will, yeah. And they will use Internet Explorer to give preference to that search engine. And so they didn't want to be at the whims of Microsoft. Microsoft and Google are kind of constantly circling each other throughout this book. Google is always terrified that Microsoft will kind of, strangle them to the cradle on certain products.
Right.
And then, so that makes a lot of sense. I get that. But the second one I thought was much more interesting, where they said, like, look, where we are, for all intents and purposes, a cloud company. We will make an increasing amount of money as people move more and more of their life to the internet. We stand to gain a lot from that. So we need to make the internet faster and more usable. And so that when they launch Chrome, not only does that provide a great new browser for a premium internet experience, but it motivates the competition, the Internet Explorers and Safaris and Firefoxes of the world. And I think they said that, like, within a year, their JavaScript engines had improved like crazy too.
Yeah, this what I thought was really cool and it showed the way that Google solves problems. Is in one way they would take something that was considered premium, give it away for free to increase user adoption, but actually it was a common good thing, right? It was like an antithesis to the tragedy of the commons, where Google kind of swoops in and goes, hey, JavaScript could actually be way better, right? And of course it's self-serving because they want the internet to be as fast as possible and people to rely on it.
Yeah.
But Google also had this kind of interesting piece where they talked about this sort of blind spot that Bill Gates had, because he would do the math and be like, they're just burning money. There's no way that this ever could be profitable, because he thought of things like storage and internet transfers as incredibly expensive. But Google had been secretly, and this is the interesting thing, Google's radically open about some things, but this book really shows you what they were radically private about.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
they were buying up dark fiber all across the country so that it would be as cheap as possible for them to move from one data center to the other. They were building data centers in a way that nobody had ever thought of, so that storage was
They're real pioneers in that space.
Yeah, super cheap for them, right? So when Google gave away a gigabyte of storage on Gmail, that was radical, because I think you had something like 15 megabytes or 100 megabytes or something total that Hotmail had. And at the time, what you did is,
I think it was low. I think it was 2 megabytes.
Oh, was it only that?
Yeah.
I can't remember. So I never had a Hotmail account. I did have, but here's the deal. Internet service providers used to offer free ones. Like, you could, whatever internet service provider, you can get an email address. And it was all what they call POP email. It was not IMAP. IMAP is where you keep your mail synced to the server. And so it could go to multiple mobile devices. If you had a POP address, basically it would, as soon as the email was downloaded to one of your devices, it wouldn't download to any of the others.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and this is how email used to be. And so this is where companies like BlackBerry had innovated ways to sync across the BlackBerry to your computer and all this weird enterprise stuff, all to sidestep IMAP. But Google wanted everything on the Google servers. They made it so that it was not even easy to delete stuff, so you just have to archive it, right? And then, but if you had it set up with IMAP, that's how it would work on an Apple device. It didn't matter. It felt the same, right? Whether I was using the Apple Mail client or if I was in gmail.com, it was all the same. And so, again, I'm saying this because I'm a few years older than you, Carter. Is that
just a little?
This transition was a big deal for small businesses. When I first started doing stuff in 2010, most people who didn't have Exchange server, Exchange was the only other way you could do sync. Most people would just do the pop account, and like syncing your emails or figuring out where they were or doing stuff was such a nightmare. And Google came in and made it dirt cheap to get the same features out of Microsoft Exchange. And then it gave you like so much storage out of the box. And then they, I think within a year, doubled it to 2 gigabytes. And again, at the time, this was mind-boggling. It was like a crazy amount of storage. And Google keeps doing this. And the reason I keep like bringing this up is that like they would just there's all kinds of, like, I remember with AdWords, they talk about AdWords a little bit. They were doing Google Analytics. They knew that if they had Google Analytics running, it would help them understand. And they were like running into issues where they couldn't wire up payment processing quickly enough. So they just decided to give it away. And it turned out to be an incredible, because they basically got this very detailed insights on a majority of the internet, way more detailed than they ever would have gotten otherwise. And then gave this tool away that was, people were charged tons of money to have this kind of insight before.
Well, let's talk about Gmail. And I think an interesting example of one of Google's blind spots, which is that they thought, okay, well, how are we going to monetize Gmail? They said, easy, ads. We'll put ads in Gmail. You're planning a hike and it'll give you an ad for hiking boots right there. And then they launch it and people are like, this is super creepy. And they're kind of like, what? I'm just like, guys, how could you not have seen that coming? Like, the email is so much more intimate and personal than search, right? Like, search, I'm coming with a specific request. I'm looking for this thing. And so you feel like if the service you're talking to says, oh, you're looking for this thing, perhaps I could interest you in this thing this person's selling. Like, that feels like a very natural part of the transaction. Email is like having a conversation at the dinner table and there's someone underneath it, like whispering to you, like, hey, have you thought about buying this thing? I don't, for the life of me, I don't understand how they didn't see that coming. I don't understand how they didn't think it was super creepy. They must have realized that at some point, because Gmail, I mean, am I crazy? Does Gmail have ads today? Like, I'm not aware of, like,
well, that's the thing. And I'll say whether I'm pretty sure they do, but the thing that's genius about Google is that they realize that most people who think that there aren't ads
exactly
are most susceptible to them. Let me see.
So I guess it says in the promotions and social tabs, those are advertised.
They move.
Good news. I never click on those tabs.
That's so funny. So what's funny too is I remember that. So I had a buddy who gave me a Gmail account, and I had no idea what Gmail was. His last name was Gagne, and I thought he was a computer science major. I'm like,
you thought it was Gagne Mail.
I was like, I thought he just like gave me some cool thing, but no, it was invite only for a while, and invite. So this is early. I mean, I'm dating myself, but this probably was around like 2006. 2005. It was very early.
Nice.
So I guess I've had my Gmail account for a very long time. But the thing was I can't remember what it was, probably like Engadget or Wirecutter or something. I learned that there's a few like words that Google won't serve ads with if they're present on the page. They weren't cuss words, but they were definitely like objectionable words. And if you hid them in your signature and just made them white text so nobody could see it, they wouldn't serve ads. And so in my signature, I would actually put these, like, there was just whatever keywords, and they weren't words that would get me in trouble. But yeah, so I had an ad-free experience very early in the process.
Speaking of more Google blind spots, I thought this was interesting. The chapter, they call it in chapter 3 of part 3, management experience, they say the great demanagement disaster, which is that Larry Page and Sergey Brin decided to get rid of all managers at Google.
So
and you might be listening and saying, hey, that sounds great. And it was a disaster because they kind of thought engineers don't want to be managed. And again, it turned out to be a big blind spot. Like they had to do kind of a survey of all the engineers and kind of say, do you want to be managed? And it was like overwhelming. Yeah, we want to be managed. Managed, everyone wants to have a good manager, but really what they were saying, I think the two big pain points were basically, we don't know who to go to if we're stuck on something. And if there are arguments amongst the engineers over what path to take, there's no tiebreaker. And then I think the third point was just career development. People, up until that point, Google had just kind of been able to hire very smart people who wanted to work on very interesting problems. But as they went bigger, there's kind of a question of like, okay, well, what is my career going to be? What am I going to grow into here at Google? And how do I navigate the increasing bureaucracy here? So I thought that was interesting. That it totally didn't work. I think they did get rid of all the managers, only for like the managers kind of like reassembled within the company and asserted control. Weird. But yeah, a blind spot on their part too.
Yeah, it was interesting. And I think it was probably after this book was done. Google had some pretty big innovations on what they call like people ops, things like this too. But they did some internal research to show like, are managers actually effective? This basically wanted to get real data on it later. And the teams that had the correct type of management structures were far more effective, like unquestionably far more effective. And it was exactly that. I mean, I think it's in the kind of sense of the like, it'd be kind of like, oh yeah, well, it's better that all processes are embarrassingly parallel. So let's just get rid of mutexes and make everyone do that. And you're like, well, sometimes I need mutexes, right? Like sometimes you can over rely and it's a bad pattern. And I think that's their instinct was, we don't want it in this like over hierarchical, middle manager explosion culture where there's like a manager of a manager of a manager of a manager. I've seen that kind of structure before and it sucks. It really is like draining because you become like a report monkey, right? Like you just basically, I would get some new dictate that would come in and be like, well, fill out this spreadsheet with this stuff in it because my skip needs this data. And I'm like, I'm spending a quarter of my week on reporting junk that has nothing to do other than a middle manager needs to look good to his manager or her manager. And it was awful. So I think that's a good instinct. But I think this book also talks about this, like reins it in several ways. They were talking about, I liked this little detail in Android development. Number one, holy moly, Android was a complete train wreck. And they were actually saying that, was it Rubenstein? Rubenstein was like, not sure if Android was even going to be ready at launch, like within 3 months. Within 3 months of the launch, and
they're like, it didn't work. It crashed all the time.
Yeah, it was like crashing, and so like, but Sergey and Larry were like just complete wrecking balls, but also incredibly important in the process of making this thing work. And one of the like hilarious stories is they were like, "Oh, what's a cool app that's on Android?" And I think it was Sergey was like, "Oh, I made this one where." You can throw your phone up in the air and then catch it, and they'll tell you how long it was in the air with like the accelerometer. And of course, the team's like, "Please don't throw this glass and metal device up in the air. Like it's like a nightmare." But it showed their curiosity of like, "Oh, this thing can do this." So of course, I'm going to write some code and play around with its like abilities, and not thinking like, "Oh, wait a second. If we encourage a bunch of our customers to do this, they're going to break their phones like all the time."
Well, and Android had gone to Google because Android did not start out as an internal Google project. Android was a separate company. And what Rubenstein, is that the guy who was in charge of Android? Yeah. So Dave Rubenstein? I don't remember.
And he was the one who, it was originally focused on being a camera operating system, right? Like
yes. So then they pivot to a mobile operating system, and so then they go to Google looking for an investment. And I think they kind of thought, if we have an investment from Google, one, money is nice, and two, we could have like a strategic partnership with them, and we could integrate their services better into our phone. But in that meeting, I think it was Larry Page was like, what if we just bought you guys? They've been thinking about getting into the mobile space for a while. but also Android starts out as more of a BlackBerry competitor. Like that's how the operating system, they anticipate it being. I think they had like two versions of it. They had, I think they called it the Sooner version and then the Dream version. The Sooner version was like a BlackBerry type, where the primary interface is, physical buttons. Then the iPhone is unveiled. And they realize like, okay, this is the future. And so they kind of drop what they call the Sooner version and pivot to the Dream version, which is the full screen, the modern smartphone we all know today. I think it was also Larry Page who had the weird idea. He wanted you to be able to scroll your contacts by using the accelerometer. Like you could tilt your phone and it would scroll it. And
That
they
sounds horrible.
I know, they're like, Larry, this is such a dumb idea. And then so they just had to build it and say like, Larry, look at this, like it's awful. And he's like, okay, fine.
It reminded me of like on Apple devices. I think you can still have it on even to today. You could like shake to undo. And never once did I do that on purpose. Like never once I was like, oh yeah, I didn't mean to do that. Yeah. It was more like my jostle my phone and it's like deletes everything, and I'm like, no.
Whenever I remember that, and like the one, because I have it set on my phone, and like when it comes in handy like every 6 months. Like I remember, like this is exactly what I need.
I remember when they I do like some of the, and they talk about this too. There's like a lawsuit, because Google has this idea of like just doing things and then asking for forgiveness later. They imitated all of the multi-touch gesture and some of the other special interfaces with the iPhone. Of course, Apple sues them because they have like patents on how movement works and stuff. Some of these are pretty innovative. And so like I understand you have to defend your patents if you want them to be, in place. But it really like hamstrung the phone for a little while. And then they were like, oh yeah, and then Palm Pilot just like came in and stole all that stuff too. Yeah. And I think eventually they had to just drop a lot of that because but yeah, it's, and I remember how volatile that was. Those early years of smartphones, everyone was still trying to figure out how do you even use these, right? Like it was not obvious that like what we take for granted now, and Android and Apple are different, but they're also very, very similar.
Absolutely.
These days.
Well, and that's a whole interesting discussion. I know Google is the beneficiary. There was that court case several years ago where I think it was Oracle was suing Google over Android because it was written in Java, and Oracle basically said like, yeah, that's our programming language. And I believe, I might be getting the details wrong here, but I believe Google essentially rewrote Java under the hood. Like I think there's their proprietary or their version of it. But Oracle was saying, yeah, but all the like the APIs, we invented those APIs. So those are ours. And so that was the big question in court was, are APIs copyrightable? And the judge ruled in Google's favor. I remember reading about that. The judge actually taught himself just a little bit of Java just so he could kind of understand it, which I thought was pretty neat. But that's kind of the same thing with like Apple and the multi-touch gestures, which is like, can you really own a patent on pinch to zoom?
I know. And
yeah,
I'll tell you that like, I actually think some of the worst patents that exist are some of the intellectual property patents that are based around mathematics. So traditional mathematics is not patentable, but code is. And that's weird because code is mathematics. So I've always thought that was really strange. And then the other one is they call it business processes. And so you can patent the actual way you do something, which is the other way that like, Apple will try to do stuff, which is to me is so anti-competitive because a company will forgo innovation, slightly change their business process, and then repatent that new version of the business process so that nobody can touch the output of the thing that they're making.
I'm generally pro patent, like very generally. Like I think it's good. I think done right, patents are a way to encourage innovation because if you're going to go out on a limb and invent something, you want some assurances that someone like it's the whole like first mover dilemma, right? You don't want to put a bunch of R&D into something just for everyone to then copy you and kind of rip you off. But yeah, like it's sticky stuff. And again, things like pinch to zoom, like,
Yeah, it is interesting of like, is that an obvious innovation or is that
mhm.
truly innovative? And I think those are interesting questions. Let's see.
Yeah, like I said, lots to talk about here.
Yeah, no, there's so many things that we could go off and riff on, but I'm just trying to remember. We definitely have to talk about YouTube. Where I mean, a lot of people are actually watching this on YouTube.
Yeah, I mean, let's talk about YouTube. YouTube's our bread and butter.
Yeah.
Well, so I guess, yeah,
Another acquisition, right?
another
it is
acquisition
interesting too that like some of the biggest innovations, Facebook and Facebook's not talked about in this book at all, actually.
Yeah, because this book I think was written like 2011.
They did mention it because
Sheryl Sandberg. Yeah.
ended up going off to there, but and I think she had done it right around the time of this book coming out. But yeah, it was interesting because Facebook wasn't part of this. They weren't in an acquisition spree yet, but I think one of the things that made Facebook, or I guess Meta now, so innovative is that they ended up seeing user adoption innovations that they needed. Right? They bought Instagram, they bought WhatsApp, they bought Oculus, these platforms that they thought they could lose out on, and they wanted to be in those spaces. Google did the same thing, right? They ended up buying a bunch of companies, and some of them have just really become household names. And I think the YouTube one was interesting because they talked about the fact that they let YouTube stay independent.
Yes,
for the most part, right? Because they had actually just acquired another company that was supposed to get them into the like traditional radio ad space. It was a disaster. They spent like almost $1 billion on it, and they tried to do a top-down implementation. It just didn't work out well. So they let YouTube kind of do their own thing for a while, and of course that turned out to be amazing for them.
Yeah. We already talked a bit about how YouTube kind of won by being a little scrappier, again by looking the other way on copyright. They some strategic mistakes Google made was because Google they first roll out Google Video, which is essentially like it really is just kind of like the video tab on Google search, where they thought, okay, you can type something in and we'll have all these videos for you. But a couple mistakes there, which is one, there's no easy way for me to upload a video, right? Google Video just pointed to existing videos. And two, there was no easy way to play the videos. You would click into the link, but then you're taken to that website's video player. Right. YouTube has, the realization that what people want is a place to host their own videos, and then they they build just an interface for that, and so it's very easy to watch said videos. And another way, this is interesting, where Google and YouTube are similar and what they capitalize on. This is an idea I've been thinking a lot about. They talk about the long tail of businesses, or the long tail of content, which is just, that you think of a distribution, right? And so most searches or videos or whatever are going to be kind of within that standard distribution. But then the way kind of the bell curve, right? But then the way that the internet works is on those tails, there's just a very, very, very long tail of completely obscure topics that aren't covered if you're kind of focusing on the most popular topics. And so, something they point out is like someone might be searching for snowboarding videos, and then a snowboarding instructor in that zip code who's looking for clients might advertise on YouTube, which just like, a snowboarding instructor in, my zip code is never going to run a national ad campaign or even a local ad campaign. And so, they really capitalize on that. And, it's just interesting listening to YouTube then versus what it became later, what it is now. They restricted videos to 10 minutes. Which is very different from today. I mean, this podcast episode is going to be about an hour long, and we can upload the entire thing to YouTube.
Yeah, I remember when the limit was 10 minutes. It's funny. I guess this is maybe because, my wife and I are sort of geriatric millennial era. I was like I was born in the early 80s.
Yeah.
So there's
You
a
and I are
lot
like
of
the
this.
tail end of the millennials.
Yeah.
Or
And so, yeah. So, yeah, it's funny. We're probably on
yeah.
like both ends of the spectrum.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, 3 or 4 years older, I would have been the, very end of Gen X. And,
Mhm.
but what's funny is that we were very online, and there's an entire, like, I would say, like, I'm very nostalgic about the early 2000s internet. And so my daughter is very aware of a lot of this stuff. So a lot of things used to, before YouTube, it was all Flash animations, and Flash
Oh
was
yeah.
this like animation framework that Adobe had made. It was like
You ever watch Homestar
proprietary.
Runner?
Yes, yeah, who just had a
Yeah.
reboot, by the way.
Oh, nice, nice.
Oh yeah, my daughter is very good at drawing Trogdor the
Yeah.
Burninator, and so, but we've kind of went through the era of the Numa Numa song and Yon
Yep. Yep.
Cat and all the other like cool early YouTube stuff, and it was like people were figuring out how to use these platforms, and there was just some playfulness to it that I really appreciate. And of course, so my daughter is like a indirectly like she's like a millennial meme lord in some levels. So yeah,
Raise them
but
up right.
one of the things I thought was interesting from this too is that the San Bruno office was the YouTube office. They were allowed to culturally be separate, but they gave them a weird constraint. So the Android team, they were allowed to hire whoever they wanted. It was so different. It was all hardware. It was all this other stuff. But the YouTube team was not allowed to hire whoever they wanted. They had to use they had to use the Google hiring process, which was just a pain in the butt. At this time, it was also famous for being like 13 freaking interviews, just complete madhouse.
Yeah,
And then, of course, Larry Page gets to sign off on whether you become an employee at the end with his little shortened memo thing. Maybe we didn't talk about this, but yeah, Larry Page would actually
he approved every employee.
He would literally get like a super summary with all these scores and stuff like this, and he would literally have like final veto rights. So anyway, it was such a pain that they basically realized internally, they were like, we were edgy and small and they were getting big. And so they could attract talent from inside of Google for folks who maybe missed the early days of Google, right? Like either they weren't there and they wish they were in a smaller company, or they were there at Google when it was small and they wanted to rekindle that. And so they ended up getting really good at doing internal hires, which I think was genius because these are the software architects that you want to build to scale, right? Somebody who's like, I've gone from this to, 1 billion queries a day. You need those kind of engineers to build YouTube. And an amazing thing that would come out of it, I think I've talked about this. The book doesn't talk about this, but I'll bring it up. YouTube infrastructure isn't talked about as much, but there's a really interesting commercial application now called PlanetScale DB. PlanetScale is interesting because it's not Postgres. Like all the cool kids use Postgres now if you're building anything with SQL. PlanetScale uses MySQL, and MySQL used to be super popular, but that's what YouTube originally built on because that was like part of the LAMP stack, right? And they've built this really amazing technology that is what powers PlanetScale, is what came out of YouTube. So it's like to build these easily shardable, horizontally scalable to massive data systems, databases. And it's just, I think it's so cool that this is again another like open source innovation hub came from doing these like crazy weird things that a bunch of really smart Google engineers who became YouTube engineers ended up building infrastructure. Now everybody, you can use that tooling now too.
And they mentioned in the book, the engineers, that when they acquired YouTube, they kind of had like an interesting cross pollination between the two companies, where you would the people who kind of were looking for different things in their careers at that point. Like you had some Google engineers go to YouTube because they kind of felt like, geez, like it's gone really. It's too big here. Like I remember the good old days when we were young and scrappy, so I'm going to go to YouTube. And you had some YouTube engineers that are like, we're kind of flying by the seat of our pants here. I'd like to work on something a little more established, and so they would go to Google. So that was funny with YouTube. They'd kind of, when asked about, YouTube when they were still independent, they were asking about their future or whatever. They're like, well, we're going to build a brand. We're going to build a giant company here, but in private they were saying like, geez Louise, we hope someone acquires us. Like they knew that they were, I mean, they had the tiger by the tail.
They were bleeding
exactly
money. You know, I think were they Y Combinator? I can't remember.
No, it's a big one. I think it's Sequoia.
Oh, that's right, Sequoia.
Yeah,
that's right. Sequoia backing them. But yes, they were looking at their numbers and just being like, "This is going to be so hard to get into." And of course, you know, YouTube eventually had to get into a proper monetization regimen too, and Google was perfectly set up for that, right? They already had the ads network to handle it. So
and it was interesting too. I think I can't remember who said it. So I think might have been the chief financial officer. But talking about YouTube, they kind of he killed the idea of the silver bullet for YouTube. That there was going to be some really unique, really cool way to monetize it. He was like, nah, it's just ads. Like, you know, that's how we're going to do it. And then kind of adhering to Google's philosophy that like, hey, the more people on the internet, the better. As more people get on the internet, we make more money. That's what spurs Android TV, which is the idea like, hey, if we can make it easy for someone to watch YouTube on their television as opposed to just their computer, then more people will watch YouTube and more people will see our ads, and then more people, you know, will then we'll make more money. Which I think is another example of Google spending a lot of money and effort on something that doesn't have a clear, from the outside user, it doesn't have a clear monetization strategy.
right.
But it works. And it's funny when how that works and how it doesn't sometimes. I listened to a podcast with the founders of Substack, and the CEO of Substack, Chris Best. Prior to that, he was the CTO for Kick. And Nathan, I mean, do you remember Kick? It was a messaging app between.
Yeah. Oh, that's so funny. I actually probably was at a South by Southwest session with him because I remember the founders at Kick.
Oh, interesting.
I didn't really know who they were. This has been like in 2014 or something. That's so funny. I didn't realize that there was a connection there.
Yeah. So he was the CTO of Kick, which was like a messaging platform, and its big advantage back in the day was it made it easy to message between Blackberries and iPhones. But since that's something they struggled with at Kick, was like they had so many users, like hundreds of millions, they didn't know how to make money off of any of them. He said that when what his biggest lesson, he's like, when he started Substack, he's like, what would you tell new entrepreneurs? He's like, have a business model, right?
Yeah,
Substack just, you know, it's a simple business model. They take 10%, right? But it's so it's funny that works out sometimes. Like Facebook kind of was in the same position. They didn't have an idea for how they were going to monetize. They just thought, let's just get users. We'll figure out what to do with them later. Worked out great for Facebook, not so much for Kick. And Google's a little different because, like, yeah, maybe Android TV isn't directly monetizable, but it's a pretty good theory, which is just more people will watch YouTube, which will make it so we can charge more for our ads.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting too. The you know, I actually pay for YouTube Premium for the family version of YouTube Premium. Namely because I don't want my daughter to be exposed to ads.
Oh yeah.
And it's a so much more enjoyable experience. Every once in a while I'll be like in a browser tab that I'm not logged in with, or you know, profile or whatever, and I'm like, this is horrible. Like I don't.
Oh yeah.
It just sucks. But most people, that's how or they have their ad blocker stuff, I guess. But I could have done the ad blocker path, but I was like, I'm in a good spot to pay for it. I want YouTube to exist, and I'd like.
I appreciate the convenience of it. I've got YouTube Premium too. I watch probably too much YouTube. It's funny with my kids because they, like, you know, just growing up, you know, as millennials, you know, me on the younger end, you on the other end. Like advertising was just so ubiquitous. Like I remember just watching like Rugrats or Blue's Clues or whatever, and like of course you see ads. And so I'm really glad my kids don't grow up in that world. Like I think advertising to children is weird. It's also funny though, the very rare times where they do see an ad, it like one shots them. They just have no antibodies built up for it. They just see an ad for a product. They're just like, oh wait, we have to get that, don't we? Whereas I think if you grow up with so many ads, you just kind of learn to tune them out a little bit. So I am curious, as this younger generation grows up without exposure to ads, like, I don't know, when you start to wind up in a place where you're seeing more and more of them, does that change? And then there's a whole new world of advertising, like with Instagram, right? Where like ads are less polished these days, right? Like they're made to look more just like content. Yeah, fascinating stuff. I have a buddy who's talking about the idea of ads and large language models and whether it's a viable business. And I have a lot of thoughts on it. But my other thought is just like, who's thinking about putting ads in large language models right now? Google, right? Like
no question about it. Because
exactly.
yeah, they're now that they have the now that they have the LLM mode, for search engine, it'll be interesting. And I think I brought this up last time. I thought that OpenAI might have been game over for Google.
Yeah.
Maybe about a year ago, I was listening to some of the doomsdayers on this, and I was like, I think it might be right. But Google really stepped up in a way that only Google can, right? And again, this book actually shows us why this is possible. They have such a deep knowledge in cloud infrastructure. No one can catch up to that. They have such a deep obsession with as fast as possible query returns on results. And again, I don't think anyone has caught up on that. I mean, not even looking at the quality of stuff, because I think it's always a race, and month to month, Anthropic or OpenAI or Google Gemini seems to be out ahead slightly. But if you just look at how fast the query comes back, Google wins every time. Gemini is such a fast response on their models, and I think that is long term going to win, right? If I have to think like, oh man, OpenAI has got this thinking model, but it's going to take it, a few minutes to give me what I want, where Gemini might just do it faster. Like I'll be like, it's fine, I'll do the faster one.
Well, and that was kind of a point of pride at Google. Like engineers could, they could measure things within like 100 milliseconds.
Right.
That was viewed as like a talent you should hone at Google. And they had studies showing like, if the search takes 400 milliseconds versus 600 milliseconds, you see a legitimate increase in how many people use search. And, you can't think like 400 versus 600 milliseconds. Like, what are you talking about? But that's kind of a running theme throughout the whole book, is Google's obsession with speed. In particular, I think it's Larry Page's obsession with speed that kind of percolates throughout the company. Lots of really interesting stuff here. We didn't even talk about the data centers and the whole, cool.
You definitely worth checking out in the book. And we also we don't really talk about too much, and maybe it'll come up more in the next. I keep bumping the table. Maybe it'll come up more in the next episode. But like, Google started over these years to develop a reputation for building out stuff that people love to use, and then axing the project when it didn't seem to have a path to viability, to the point where like I quit trusting new services, because I was like, I can't rely on this, because if in 3 years they decide it's a no-go. Where Apple is always a lot more careful, but when they roll something out, they stick to it more times than not. It's not always true, but
Amazon is like that with AWS. Like if you launch something at AWS, like the expectation is like, if it's a public facing launch, like, get ready to support this for about 15 years.
Right.
You
can still do your SOAP queries on your Mechanical Turk service that's still at Amazon Web Services. So many cool stuff. I'll just give one shout out to, I think they built their very first data center in the Dalles, which is a city in Washington. So, okay. Now I want to like give a shout out, and now I feel like a moron. I believe, the Dalles is in Oregon. It's on the other side. It's right on the border of Washington and Oregon. Yeah. Yes, exactly. I grew up right near the Dalles. Not like I'm like 90 minutes from the Dalles, but I have friends in the Dalles, and so I was like, oh wow, the Dalles. And so, shout out to the Dalles. If I remember correctly, that one's also green. That's a green. So there's certain locations that you pay a little bit of a premium on, but you actually get like full carbon offsets and everything else.
Oh, cool.
I think that's the one. Roast me in the comments if I'm wrong, but I think that's the one that you can.
Get him, fellas.
Yeah, get me. But you can sleep better at night if you're concerned about your impact on the environment.
Absolutely. Well, let's wrap up. Let's take our usual questions. So, what are we going to do differently in our career as a result of having read this part of the book? Nathan, what about you?
I'm kind of riffing off of what you'd mentioned last week that you wanted to be more ambitious.
Yeah,
And I
yeah,
was like, when I'm thinking big, don't be afraid to think even bigger, right?
yeah,
So, and they talk about this a lot. They're like, okay, well, how do we solve this problem at 10x or 100x?
yeah.
Some people might argue this is premature optimization, but I think it's still a good way of thinking of, could this serve that larger audience? And if I am I doing this in a way that like we really could dominate an entire category if we wanted to?
Yeah, I had that too. I mean, I want to think big. I'm just realizing that about myself. Like, I'm very much like I'm a very prudent decision maker in the sense that like my life will kind of always be in like the top 10%, like a 90th percentile life. Like, I'm never going to go bankrupt. I'm never going to go to jail, right? Like, I don't anticipate my marriage falling apart or anything like that, right? But I've just been thinking lately, like, what gets you to the 99th percentile? What gets you to the 99.9th percentile? And you got to be more ambitious. You got to think bigger.
Right.
So I don't know, when we do our accountability check, I don't know how we're going to follow up on this one, but we're agreed. We got to think bigger. So we'll hold ourselves to that. And
It's
then,
true.
who do we recommend the book to? Nathan?
Yeah. So this is unchanged. I think that folks that are fascinated or horrified by the meteoric rise of Google, right? Also, Steven Levy books are amazing. Just
Oh, yeah.
check them out anyway. But yeah, this is. I feel like I'm a better software engineer by having this. Think of this like as a case study of like how things can work out. And I was actually at a thing. I had like a meetup with some friends. I'm in Texas right now. We have a bunch of friends here in Texas, and I was like talking about how we were reading this book for a podcast. And one of my good friends, who's an excellent software engineer, he's like, I read this book, and this is what made me want to go into software engineering.
Oh, wow.
So it's a very inspiring book. If this kind of web scale type, you know, crazy growth stuff is exciting to you, this is a very inspiring book in that sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'll say that too. I mean, anyone who's looking to be inspired, like, I think we've been inspired by this book. And I also think anyone who wants to understand kind of how the modern web, or I guess why the modern web looks like it does. Like we say, it's kind of Google's world, and we're just living in it. We didn't even talk about their kind of war against the concept of files. They
Oh
said,
yeah.
files aren't going to exist. It's just all going to be online. We didn't talk about Google Docs at all, which is, a big obviously we're all familiar with Google Docs. I'm reading off of Google Doc right now.
Right.
Yeah, there, and so much of what we think. Go
In
ahead.
those files, so in that section on files, we hear a name that has now become the CEO of the company.
Sundar Pichai, yeah, he shows
Yes.
up.
Yeah, he's not even he's not, when this book was written, he wasn't the CEO, but he was already doing product vision stuff, and you can see
Yes,
his brain at work in the
yeah, yeah,
book.
yeah. Lots of names pop up. We've already talked about Melissa Mayor, our CEO of Yahoo. We talked about Sheryl Sandberg,
Mhm.
Chris Sacca,
Yep.
big investor. You might recognize him from Shark Tank. Shows up. Yeah, lots of famous names pop up in this book. Yeah, so I think this is a good book to read if you want to kind of understand, like, why does the web look like it does today, and also the impact that someone's vision can have on a category space. I mean,
Yep.
who knows? Maybe the web these days is kind of too big, too ingrained to be affected by some bold visionaries like this. But there are new emerging markets every day, and it's cool to think about the impact one might be able to have on them. But that wraps us up for this week. Thanks for tuning in, everyone. We're excited. Next week we'll wrap up this book, and then we're moving on. I actually don't think we know what we're reading next. We'll figure it out. Don't worry, folks.
We'll groom the backlog.
Yeah, yeah. We have no shortage of books we could read. But yeah, contact us at contact@bookoverflow.io. You can tag us on LinkedIn. We're just Carter Morgan and Nathan Toups on LinkedIn. You can find me on Twitter at Carter Morgan. You can find the podcast on Twitter at Book Overflow Pod. And you can find Nathan and his work with Functionally Imperative at functionallyimperative.com. Thanks for sticking around, folks. We enjoy making the podcast. We're hoping you're enjoying listening to it. And we'll see you next week.
See ya.